I'm Sam Gregory. I am the Executive Director of the Human Rights Network Witness, and it is a great pleasure to be here to help moderate this panel. So as we highlighted, this panel is really focused, excuse me, I'm rumbling, is that me? On how do we empower emerging technologies, and particularly decentralized web technologies and blockchain for global equity. I think we have a real range of perspectives here that's going to come from the panelists, and I'm excited to hear from us. I'm going to keep the intros short so we have plenty of time for conversation and stories. We're going to take Rainey Reitman's advice to heart and hopefully share some stories to really make this concrete. So I'm joined today by three panelists. Let me pull up my notes in front of me. So first on my left, Enrique Crespo Peña Herrera, who is the Regional Digital Advisor at UNDP's Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, and has over 10 years experience working around digitalization, governance, and innovation. To Enrique's left, Alex Essenler, Deputy Director of Open Archive, similarly over a decade's work in digital rights and human rights, media, democracy, and communications, including work at such stalwarts of this space as Global Voices, the Center for Global Communication Studies, and the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. And Candice Kelly, the Chief Legal Officer of the Stellar Development Foundation, where she leads the legal and policy teams, and the Stellar Development Foundation supports the development and growth of Stellar, an open source network that connects the world's financial infrastructure. So, I'm going to ask each of you to just settle us in this space. Tell us about how your team, your organization, and yourself is stewarding impact through blockchain or other emerging technologies. And maybe we can start with you, Candice.
Sure. So as you just said, the Stellar Network is an open, decentralized blockchain network, and the foundation where I work supports the ecosystem surrounding that. So the developers, the projects, the businesses that are working on that. And it's open to anyone, but what the foundation's mission is creating equitable access to the global financial system. So some of the things that we just heard about in the last panel, we think a lot about, particularly in the African examples from the last panel, in order to help people who are in a different economy, in a different, have a different relationship, or maybe are unbanked. That there are 1.4 billion people who are unbanked in the world. Some of them, they don't need to be banked. I think that was a really good point. There are other alternatives, and having the digital and blockchain economies interoperate with the traditional financial infrastructure is what the foundation has been focused on for a really long time. So stable assets, fast, secure transactions, and so without going on and on and on, those are the things that we are really focused on. And I think the most important thing also is because it's a globally accessible network, that it's local communities and local developers that we help and support, either technologically, financially, or just making connections to solve those local community problems. Because as we've already heard today, they're very different depending on where you are in the world.
So I want us to come back to that question of co-design and work with communities. I think we're going to have some really interesting perspectives here. And I'm also going to come back to you for a story in a moment to really crystallize what you do. Alex.
Yeah, so at Open Archive, we're focused on mobile media archiving. And as an organization, we do a lot of research, so understanding what communities, organizations, typically smaller organizations at the moment, are doing in terms of their archiving processes, how they get it from documenters to those who are sometimes archivists, but typically project managers who are receiving that media. And typically this media is usually of human rights protests, human rights violations, really evidentiary media, or just telling kind of capturing their own people's history. So when it comes to the blockchain and DWeb, what we're looking at is how can that technology be useful to address our community's needs when it comes to reliable, secure, accessible, verifiable, redundant, and long-term storage for that media they're collecting. And in addition to the research work that we do with communities, we have an app called SAVE, Share, Archive, Verify, Encrypt. And we're looking at how we can have an IPFS backend connected to the Save app so that it is easy as possible for communities to use decentralized storage in their kind of daily practices. And we're really thinking, again, about co-design, how to meet people where they're at when it comes to their technical knowledge, their resources, and how can we make sure in this space of decentralization, we're integrating human rights-centered design, so thinking about at-risk communities first and digital rights through the design, building, iteration process.
Great, thanks, Alex. Enrique.
Thank you. So I guess coming from a different kind of world perspective, for us at the United Nations Development Program, we're thinking about digital as an enabler of development, because it's a transversal axis that is crossing by or cross-cutting everything that we do, whether that's peace, democracy, or climate change. We are seeing the power that digitalization has. And we have a model that we really like at UNDP, which is leaving no one behind, which I think is quite connected with the reflections that my co-panelists were making. And in that sense, what we're thinking of specifically in my case for the region, Latin America, the Caribbean, is how can digitalization cross paths with government, with infrastructure, with people, with economy, with regulation, in a framework that allows us to promote access to technology and discuss it in terms of inclusive digitalization. Because again, we are seeing in the region, from a broader perspective, that a lot of people are getting behind. Because for us in Latin America and the Caribbean, the disparities when it comes to access to technology have the looks of rural side versus urban side. So in the urban centers in Latin America, you see the big capitals, people have access to internet. In the rural side, it's less than 2 out of 10 people who have access just to internet. And I know that's a concept that it's not as easy to grasp because we're here in the United States, so not something quite simple to say you're disconnected, but that happens. And only 5 countries in the region have access to 5G in a commercial way. So we're still, again, kind of feeling that there is still a sense of we're getting left behind as a region, broadly from fourth industrial revolution point of view. And I guess us as UNDP, what we're trying to do is how do we enable governments, states, and people in these paths to create digital public goods that allow for us to have a process of inclusive digitalization in the region, but broadly, I would say all around the world, because the discussion about openness and sharing knowledge, I think from a South-South cooperation perspective, is quite fundamental for us.
Thanks, Enrique. So I'm going to come back and, again, picking up Rainey's admonition from this morning, ask you each maybe to share a story that crystallizes what you do and perhaps why you do it as well, around perhaps a specific project that is really important to you.
Sure, I'll start.
Candace.
So I'd love to tell the story of how we worked with the UN High Commission for Refugees on humanitarian aid. And the story begins with the Stellar Development Foundation recognizing that access to the blockchain and access to crypto or stablecoins, which is what we care about the most when you're dealing with remittances, is really difficult. It was really difficult. You need a bank account or you need a credit card to buy crypto. So we worked really closely and integrated with MoneyGram. And so now in any MoneyGram, well, 180 countries so far, MoneyGram locations, you can cash in and cash out. You can bring in your local currency and you can get US dollar coins in your wallet. And then it's in your wallet. You don't need to use MoneyGram anymore. You can use the Stellar network to transact. You can send that home. You can send that back to your home country or you can hold it if you're in a place with an unstable local currency. So those were the first use cases that we were thinking of. And then UN reached out right as the war in Ukraine began and said, hey, the problem we have is there's a war. And we have to go there with a big bundle of cash and put a target on our backs and put a target on the recipient's backs who have to come to a physical location to get their aid. And if we can use MoneyGram and we can use this, this flow of funds, we can get aid to people even if they're sitting in a bunker. And fast forward to today, 1,600 people have received aid that way. $2 million worth of aid so far has been distributed. And in the process of that, we helped with technology, an open source tool to have sort of a mass distribution tool so they can upload a huge number of wallet addresses that they've already made sure that they qualify for the aid and be able to, in a press of a button, get it out to a lot of folks. And then that same tool can be used for gig workers. It can be used with other people facing different challenges in their own regions, their own industries. So that's one of our real life stories.
Great, thanks, Candice. So from financial access and equity to, I guess, narrative power and control of your own stories, Alex?
Yeah, so one of our main programs at Open Archive is our DAC program, or Decentralized Archivist Community Program. And through that, we work with different communities who, the thing that threads them together is they're all focusing on mobile media archiving. Typically, they have documenters who are on the ground and capturing images of whatever kind of issue focus they have. We're working with a group in Ukraine who's documenting war crimes and survivor stories. We have organizations in both Sudan as well as in Ecuador who are documenting environmental land rights issues within both of those countries, and in Sudan also documenting elections and what's happening during election times. And the first thing we do whenever we're engaging with the community is this needs assessment phase. So really understanding where the organization, where the people that they're working with are at, so that when we're thinking about introducing new technologies, thinking about, okay, within this Save app that we have, how do we want to explain IPFS, explain this decentralized storage system? The needs assessments are so crucial, and you see both overlapping as well as divergent needs amongst these different organizations working in different contexts. And I think one key thing that we found throughout all of our needs assessments with communities is you still do have, and I think as Nuke was saying, these digital divides, for lack of a better word, where you have organizations in Sudan who one of their main struggles is, hey, our documentaries on the ground don't have internet connectivity, so how are they supposed to, beyond thinking of decentralization, just send us, and how are we supposed to get that data and information? You have other communities like in Ukraine who are like really gunning and excited for decentralization for their backends because they have a little bit more technical knowledge. But across all of them, I think a big question is this idea of resources. And a question of, okay, who within their team is going to be responsible, who needs to be trained up technically so that they do have ownership and empowerment of these new backends that they're using. And I think in Rainey's keynote, what was mentioned about how there's just this kind of tendency to go with the corporate option, the centralized option, because it might be easier to maintain. It might be the resource that, just because these organizations, especially in the activist communities, are doing so much else and have such a heavy burden on them, it is just the option that is easiest to go with, gets your work done, even though it might not be the safest, most secure and resilient. So I think with decentralization, it's really figuring out how can you reach people in a way that shows how this new technology addresses these risks, these issues, these gaps that they're facing, and really have a bit more of a kind of pull to the technology when some of their systems might be working just as fine, but from a digital security perspective could be much better.
Thanks, Alex. Enrique, a story that crystallizes for you.
I guess it's a twofold thing, because in my end, what I'm seeing now within the United Nations system is, we were discussing earlier on, is precisely capacity building. Because when we are working on democracy or again on climate change, and we're thinking at the crossroads of digitalization, even myself, I'm a political scientist, I did a master's in public administration, so I am not a coder, not a programmer, but I'm working as a regional digital advisor. So I always think about it when it comes to me. What's the experience? How do you do this in your job? You don't need to be an expert. You need to be a coder. You need to be aware of how these worlds connect. And that is one of the reflections that we're promoting inside UNDP, actually, with Algorand Foundation. We're working on a blockchain academy for development, because what we want our program officers to know or to be aware of is, how does blockchain work? How does it align to what we promote as United Nations Development Program? And how can it, on practical terms, connect with what we do? And I think one of the examples that we have for the course is precisely an example of your work with UNHCR. We're telling them, look, this is possible. In tough situations, blockchain could be an alternative. And we also have examples from the region, in Ecuador, actually, my country office, just in value chains. We were trying to add value to coffee sellers and retailers in our country, because we export a lot of coffee. They didn't know how to make the traceability process more effective so they can enter European markets and American markets because of the regulations. And we decided, hey, why don't we do a pilot with blockchain? So we can tell the story from the grain to your cup of coffee. Where does it come from? And it actually added value in a way that it became a successful pilot and allowed these producers that were in a very vulnerable situation to access markets in Europe. So then again, I very much concur with your comment. When you show people the value, whether it's at different levels, for a UN officer, it might be how it aligns with your principles. For a community, it will be how does it change your life. In both ways, I guess, technologies, again, can be used to effectively leave no one behind.
Sorry, can I just add something to that? And on the idea of storytelling, I think that idea of how do you communicate? How do you bridge these different areas with understanding that, okay, in a session that we ran with a bunch of different archivists and human rights activists, there's a lot of questions on, okay, blockchain. People just think automatically of NFTs and the coins, and being able to tell an effective narrative at a technical level that makes sense to these different, like you said, for you, the UN officers, the programmatic people. For us, it's the people who are documenting on the ground, the, let's say, ED of an organization who we're trying to convince to accept this new system, the program manager, coordinator, tech team who's actually going to manage it. What is that effective story that you tell that shows kind of this excitement and optimism that we have around blockchain, but also the potential kind of risks and things to be thinking about that might be challenges or kind of concerns that you'd have implementing it. So finding that storytelling is something that we're currently working on now.
Yeah, so technologies are embedded in skills, in tools, and in narratives, actually, is probably often the most important thing. I want to ask a question, maybe a different question for each of you. We're running short on time. This 20 minutes just sails by. So I'm going to ask just one question, which is to sort of, one of the things we talked about, Enrique, as we came in onto the panel is kind of the global differentials of power and who sets the agenda around technologies. So stepping it up from the community level, how have you been grappling with that in an intergovernmental context like the UN?
I guess the key part of it is that we're just starting to realize and grasp the power behind those reflections. The Secretary General just announced an AI discussion group. And when you're wondering why, and people are telling, oh, it's because it's trendy, it's because it's out there and it's fashionable. I don't think so. I think so that at the core reflection now, we need to understand that in those, as you were saying, different landscapes, for example, for us, Latin America and the Caribbean, we've always been consumers of technology. So we are always at the end of these principles already come as, okay, take it as it is. You cannot really change them or act effectively on them. And just because the past panels we discussed in Africa is similar context. We need to have active voices and empower governments, communities, nations to be able to have voices on international stages and say, okay, hey, maybe regulations in Europe and the US work this way, but for us it's not the same. We were discussing in the dinner last night just that El Salvador is a country from the region that is one of the first countries in the world to make Bitcoin completely legal as a legal currency embedded into the government structure of payment model. So I think, again, from that vision, we need to, as a system, as the United Nations, what we're trying to is give other countries, other nations empowerment so that they have voices out there to get those new ideas and new perspectives on how technologies can change and shape the world that not only come from north and south reflections from what is actually happening out there. Again, this reflection of leaving no one behind needs to start from a broader perspective of how technologies are shaping the world.
Great. Candice, can I ask a question around trust? So as you've started deploying your approach, how have you grappled with the questions of trust as you start to introduce people to new ways to think about financial transactions?
Yeah, well, it depends on the audience, but I think part of it is, is being able to really explain the immutability and the transparency of the ledger and the value of that. One piece of the UN story that I didn't mention is that internally with the UN, when you're a donor organization, they have a lot of struggle. We had a lot of conversations about how do you get your donors to trust that if you give money, it's actually going to where it needs to go? And I think we probably all in this room have had that. You see a disaster happen, whether it's in Lahaina or it's in Ukraine, and you think, I want to give money, but do I trust? Who do I trust, right? And so being able to show at its core what the blockchain does, you don't have to understand all of the technology of it, but the output and the solution that it brings with respect to transparency. And I think that was a really good example with the UN, is that certainly there is a user experience. The recipients are having a different experience as well. And also just the ability to create journeys and experiences with blockchain and crypto that are tailored to a particular situation. One of the big criticisms that as soon as the UN announced their first, this pilot, there were all these news articles like, oh, this is terrible. You're introducing all of these poor displaced Ukrainians to crypto and they're gonna lose all their money. Well, actually, no, the wallet was designed with this use case in mind, with very limited functionality. And in time, maybe that will evolve, but starting with that level of trust and understanding of who all the players are and what the technology is and what it isn't, because it's easy for people who don't understand it. The number of people, when I say blockchain, who say, I don't understand that, just sort of breaking it down into the different components.
Just briefly to add on to that, because my first encounter with blockchain and development was last summer in Istanbul, in UNDP at the same time. And my first question to the panel that was speaking back then was, isn't blockchain kind of a scam? Are they just promoting, cryptocurrencies and whatnot? And then again, it's about getting the knowledge out there of the principles that it promotes and getting people to understand the value behind it beyond, of course, what's, I would say again, commercial and most known, because then you dig it and then you say, okay, there's more to do with more to it than just what is commercial and again, fashionable. I think that can change even my own perspective on it.
So I'm getting the 2-minute flag, so I'm going to ask us to go to a key lesson learned. And I was going to ask you, Alex, as well. I read an incredible blog post that you or some of your colleagues wrote about, kind of really evaluating the pros and cons of these approaches. And I should note there's been a really vibrant community of human rights groups that FFDW has supported, who've really been trying to think through how to approach this. So maybe I can start with you with one key lesson you've learned, and then we'll go to Candice and Enrique to wrap us up with a key lesson.
I think one lesson we learned, and this is really in our open archive ethos, instead of move fast and break things, which is often the call of big tech, we really try to move slow and make sure that we're understanding things before we're implementing. And it's been a really interesting process going through this research. We have a researcher who's much more technical, and we also have a social humanities researcher as part of our research team into the DWeb. So our next step and our next blog is really going to be about kind of the pros and cons affordances for those specifically in the archive space. So kind of going from this big picture of, okay, you have all these different blockchain systems. Okay, this looks like what might be the best for this area, to, okay, now let's think about the people who are part of it and how can we make sure that we're creating new tech in a system that isn't just about corporate greed and really civic tech focused, and understanding what those human rights and digital security needs are.
Candice.
Mine is kind of along the same lines. I think being very committed and patient in the process. Payments and remittances, which is what we have been focused on since the network launched in 2014. We're coming up on 10 years. As my CEO likes to say, even under oath in front of Congress, payments are not sexy. But you know what? They're one of the best use cases for this technology. And I think as some of the bling and the hype and those types of stories are sort of falling by the wayside, we're still telling these stories. And not only are we, we started with telling the promise, and now we have actual stories and actual uses, not use cases, of this really working. And I think that it's a matter of doing that and really empowering the pioneers out there, because again, it's not the foundation that's building all of these things. We're helping, we're advising, we're giving funding, but it's people like Carmen Het, who's the treasurer of the UNHCR, who went through an incredible amount of pushback and red tape. I mean, the UN is not an easy agency to say, hey, let's employ this new technology. And so it's just slowly building that credibility and trust through the pioneers out there and the amazing builders and visionaries who are seeing this as the actual technology and how it really can solve real people's problems.
And Enrique.
For me, I would say it has to do how you frame the stories that you tell yourself and the organizations. Right now at UNDP in Latin America, the Caribbean, we're launching a digital hub. And one of the key things that I've learned from that process is there were a lot of colleagues already doing an amazing work with digital technologies. It's just that in their stories they told themselves, they didn't frame it that way. So they would be like, oh, we are creating a system to empower this community to think about human rights. But it was a digital tool that enabled the process. They were just not highlighting that future. So when you're getting the information now, that we're telling them, now it's AI and blockchain. But before that, you were already using just a website. And that was also digital. So again, it's about how you tell that story, the narratives, how it aligns to the core values of what you do, and seeing, again, technology as an enabler of sustainable development, I think for us, has been fundamental to push that agenda and to keep pushing forward to allow technology play this role of leaving no one behind.
Great. I think you've all summarized this panel better than I could try, but I'm glad to hear the words inclusion and trust and patience and slowness as being part of this, as well as other words we often associate with emerging technologies in the technology industry. So thank you so much, Candice, Alex, and Enrique.
Thank you.